For 15 years, Washington, D.C. has promised a pivot to Asia. 3 U.S. presidents from both major political parties have agreed on this, and yet it's never happened. Today, we're going to explore why the U.S. cannot leave Europe and the Middle East. What is preventing the pivot to Asia? We're going to answer that question. Hi, I'm Michael, and this channel looks at power, geopolitics, and decline from a realist perspective. In 2011, U.S. President Barack Obama announced a strategic shift. The U.S. would pivot its military focus away from Europe and the Middle East and towards Asia, especially to counter a rapidly rising China. But a decade and a half later, and U.S. money, forces, and attention are still tied up in Europe. The pivot never actually happened. To understand why many American elites believe the U.S. must pivot to Asia, you have to appreciate the incredible rise of China over the previous few decades to become the second most powerful country in the world. In 1990, Britain's economy was 3 times the size of China's. By 2025, China's economy was 5 times as large as Britain's. And China's is not finished growing. And with that economic growth has come military expansion as well. And the U.S. views this rise of China with great alarm. Thus, the decision to pivot to Asia. The idea is to use U.S. and allied forces to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in East Asia, in much the same way that the U.S. is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. So, if Obama, Biden, and Trump can all agree that the U.S. should pivot to Asia, why has it not happened? Well, reality has reared its ugly head. The crisis in the Ukraine grew intense as Obama sought ways to draw down U.S. forces in Europe. Some troops were moved out and then later brought back in. The Ukraine-Russian war kicked off in 2014 on a low scale at first, after a Western-backed coup in Kiev threw that region into chaos. Since then, the U.S. has invested heavily in the Ukraine, so no major drawdown has occurred. And structurally, the U.S. is more tied to Europe than ever before, with the recent expansion of NATO to now include Finland and Sweden. So that means the U.S. is now tied to a promise to defend more European neighbors of Russia in the event of a war. U.S. President Donald Trump has made very little secret of his contempt for NATO, but the fact remains that there has been no pivot away from Europe. There's also been no pivot away from the Middle East. The U.S. is currently gearing up for a major attack on Iran again. It's also occupying part of Syria. It periodically attacks the Houthis. It has forces in Iraq. And the U.S. Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain, off the coast of Iran. So the one thing you'll notice in this list that nearly all U.S. military concerns in the Middle East have in common is that they are all Israel's adversaries. So the U.S.'s relationship with Israel is very strange. And that relationship ties the U.S. to the Middle East. It puts the U.S. in a position of fighting one war after another war after another war for Israel. Biden did get the U.S. out of Afghanistan, although he made a mess of things. But pivoting away from the Middle East has not happened and will be very difficult for a few key structural reasons. One is the impressive influence of the Israeli lobby in Washington, D.C. And another is the political dominance in many red states, especially in the South, of Christian Zionists. So these and other factors make a U.S. pivot from the Middle East very unlikely in the near future. Also, empire has a certain inertia. These pull powers, they hold powers, they trap them. And you see this in the Ukraine and Israel, and with the U.S. inability to leave either of them. Finally, let me explain just briefly the politics of it all. They act to prevent change as well. Republicans attacked Biden for leaving Afghanistan, and Democrats attacked Trump for trying to leave Ukraine. There is political hay to be made for the opposition party to attack any major drawdown or pivot as weakness, as retreat. So democracy itself makes the pivot to Asia difficult. So what this means is that the U.S. is still stuck in Europe and the Middle East. 3 U.S. presidents in a row have been unable to pivot to Asia. Structural barriers have so far prevented the pivot, and the U.S. is committed to sealing off the entire Western Hemisphere. It's tied down in Europe. It's tied down in the Middle East. And at the same time, it's trying to contain China's meteoric rise in Asia without being able to pivot to Asia. In an empire that cannot retrench, cannot pivot, an empire fighting on 3 fronts is not pivoting anyhow. It's overstretched. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, I sure would appreciate it if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with a friend.